The doll room felt like a scene from a nightmare. Dozens of porcelain dolls stared back at Emma and Jake, their painted smiles frozen in eerie expressions. Some were missing limbs, others had cracked faces, but all of them seemed to be watching the two intruders with unblinking eyes. In the center of the room, the rocking chair continued to sway gently, as if someone invisible was sitting there, humming a tune only they could hear. "This is really creepy," Jake muttered, his voice quieter than usual. He tried to sound brave, but even he couldn't hide the unease creeping into his tone. Emma didn't respond. Her gaze darted around the room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Jake could hear it. She wanted to leave, to run as fast as she could, but her legs refused to move. It was as though the dolls were holding her in place, their lifeless gazes pinning her to the spot. "Let's just go," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "Please." But Jake wasn't ready to leave yet. For all his bravado earlier, curiosity had gotten the better of him. He stepped closer to one of the shelves, examining a doll that looked older than the rest. Its dress was faded and torn, and its glassy blue eyes reflected the faint light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up window. Something about it felt wrong. Too real, too lifelike. "Don't touch anything," Emma hissed, her panic rising. She didn't know why, but the thought of Jake touching the doll made her stomach churn. Jake paused, his hand hovering over the doll. "Why not? What's the worst that could happen?" Before Emma could answer, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't distant or muffled. They were clear, almost right next to them. The voices overlapped, some soft and childlike, others sharp and demanding. Emma spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty except for the dolls and the swaying chair. "What are they saying?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with both fear and fascination. Emma shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't make out the words, but the voices sent chills down her spine. They weren't random sounds, they were deliberate, as if they were trying to communicate something. And then, amidst the chaos of overlapping whispers, she heard it. Her name. Emma. It was soft, almost a sigh, but unmistakable. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. "Did you hear that?" she gasped, clutching Jake's arm tightly. "They said my name?" Jake frowned, glancing around the room. "I didn't hear anything." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," she snapped, her voice cracking. "It was right there. Someone, or something, said my name." Jake hesitated, torn between comforting Emma and investigating further. He wanted to believe her, but he hadn't heard anything unusual. Still, the look of sheer terror on her face was enough to make him doubt himself. Maybe the house asterisk was asterisk haunted after all. As they stood there, frozen in indecision, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Their breaths came out in visible puffs of vapor, and the air grew heavy, pressing down on them like a weight. The rocking chair stopped moving abruptly, the silence that followed deafening. Then, without warning, the door behind them slammed shut with a loud bang. Emma screamed, clutching Jake tighter. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jake rushed to the door, twisting the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed against it with all his strength, but it was as though it had been sealed shut. Panic bubbled inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm, for Emma's sake. "It's stuck," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll find another way out." Emma shook her head violently. "No, we can't stay here. Something's wrong, Jake. Something's really, really wrong." Her words hung in the air, heavy with dread. Jake glanced back at the dolls, half expecting them to have moved. To his relief, and slight disappointment, they remained exactly where they were. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, as if the entire room was alive and aware of their presence. That's when Emma noticed it, a shadow flickering near the window. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but when she looked again, it was still there. A figure, tall and faceless, stood just outside the glass, its silhouette darker than the fading daylight. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying her. "Jake," she whimpered, pointing toward the window. Jake turned quickly, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. All that remained was the empty yard beyond the broken pane. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice edged with urgency. Emma couldn't speak. Her throat tightened as tears streamed down her face, Whatever she had seen, it wasn't human, and it knew they were there. The moment Emma and Jake stepped inside, the air seemed to change. It wasn't just colder, it felt heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Dust particles swirled lazily in the dim light that filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The floorboards groaned under their feet with every cautious step they took. Neither of them spoke. The silence of the house was so thick it felt like an invisible barrier between them. Emma clutched her flashlight tightly, even though she hadn't turned it on yet. She didn't want to admit it, but she was terrified. Every creak, every shadow, made her jump. Jake, however, seemed unfazed. He walked ahead confidently, his sneakers crunching softly against years of accumulated dirt and debris. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing bits and pieces of furniture covered in dusty sheets. "Look at this place," Jake said, his voice echoing slightly. "It's like a time capsule." Emma forced a laugh, though it came out more like a nervous squeak. "Yeah, a creepy one." They moved deeper into the house, their footsteps the only sound breaking the eerie quiet. The first room they entered looked like it had once been a living room. A sagging couch sat in the center, its fabric torn and stained. An old coffee table lay overturned nearby, and shattered picture frames littered the floor. Jake bent down to pick up one of the frames, brushing off the dust. The glass was cracked, but he could still make out the faded photograph inside, a family posing stiffly for the camera. A man, a woman, and two young children stared back at him, their faces frozen in time. "Who do you think they were?" Jake asked, showing the photo to Emma. She glanced at it quickly before looking away. "I don't know. Maybe whoever lived here before. You know? Before they disappeared?" Jake finished for her, smirking. "Don't tell me you actually believe those ghost stories." Emma crossed her arms defensively. "I'm just saying, weird stuff happens in places like this." Jake rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he led the way into the next room, which appeared to be a dining area. A large wooden table dominated the space, though it was missing several legs and leaned precariously to one side. Chairs were scattered around haphazardly, some broken beyond repair. On the far wall, a chandelier hung crookedly from the ceiling, its crystals dull with grime. "This place is falling apart," Jake muttered, kicking a loose chair leg out of his path. Emma stayed close behind him, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Something about the house didn't feel right. It wasn't just the decay or the eerie atmosphere. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. The longer they stayed, the stronger the feeling became. As they moved toward the kitchen, Jake stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" Emma froze. At first, she thought he was joking, but then she heard it too, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was soft, like whispers carried on the wind, but there was no breeze inside the house. The noise grew louder, clearer, until it sounded like voices murmuring indistinctly. "What is that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Jake frowned, tilting his head as if trying to pinpoint the source. Probably just the wind outside. But Emma wasn't convinced. The whispers weren't random. They seemed deliberate, as though someone, or something, was speaking directly to them. Her grip on her flashlight tightened until her knuckles turned white. "We should go," she said urgently. "This isn't funny anymore." Jake hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. Part of him wanted to investigate further, to uncover the source of the strange noises. But another part, the rational part, knew they'd already pushed their luck far enough. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Okay, let's check upstairs real quick and then we'll leave." Emma hesitated, glancing toward the staircase. The idea of going upstairs filled her with dread, but she also knew arguing with Jake would only waste more time. Taking a deep breath, she followed him toward the steps, each one creaking ominously beneath their weight. As they reached the landing, the whispers grew louder, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. Emma's heart raced as she realized the voices weren't coming from any specific direction. They were everywhere, surrounding them completely. For a brief second, she considered turning back, running out of the house as fast as her legs could carry her. But before she could act, Jake pushed open the first door they came to, revealing a room that made her blood run cold. Inside was a collection of dolls, dozens of them, arranged neatly on shelves, their glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. In the center of the room stood a rocking chair, swaying gently despite there being no breeze. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. This was no ordinary house. Whatever secrets it held, they weren't meant to be discovered. In a small, quiet town surrounded by thick woods and rolling hills, two children, Emma and Jake, were known for their endless curiosity. They were neighbors, best friends since kindergarten, and partners in every adventure life threw their way. Emma was the more cautious of the two, often hesitating before jumping into something risky. Jake, on the other hand, was fearless to a fault. He lived for thrills, always daring Emma to step just a little further out of her comfort zone. On this particular autumn afternoon, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Emma and Jake had spent most of the day riding their bikes through the neighborhood, but boredom eventually set in. That's when Jake spotted it, a house at the edge of the forest that everyone avoided. The house looked ancient, like it had been forgotten by time itself. Its wooden walls were gray with age, and vines crept up its sides like nature trying to reclaim it. Most of the windows were shattered, leaving dark, empty holes where light used to shine. The front porch sagged under years of neglect, and the once-red door now leaned crookedly on its hinges. It stood alone, far from the other houses in the area, as if deliberately isolated. "Have you ever been inside?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with excitement. Emma shook her head. "No way. Everyone says it's haunted." Jake rolled his eyes dramatically. "Haunted? Come on, Em. Ghosts aren't real. It's probably just some old lady who didn't want visitors." But even as he said it, there was a flicker of doubt in his tone. Stories about the house had circulated around town for years. Some people claimed they'd heard strange noises coming from within its walls, cries, laughter, even music. Others swore they'd seen lights flickering late at night, despite no one living there for decades. One particularly chilling tale involved a family who disappeared without a trace after moving into the house. No bodies were ever found, and the mystery remained unsolved. Still, Jake wasn't one to back down from a challenge. "Want to check it out?" he asked, already knowing what her answer would be. Emma hesitated. She wanted to say no. Every instinct told her to turn her bike around and head home. But she also didn't want Jake to think she was a coward. Plus, deep down, there was a tiny part of her that was curious. What if the stories were true? What if the house really was haunted? Wouldn't it be exciting to see proof? "Fine," she said finally, though her voice wavered. "But we're not staying long." Jake grinned triumphantly. "Deal. First one to chicken out has to buy ice cream tomorrow." With that, the two hopped off their bikes and approached the house cautiously. The closer they got, the more ominous it seemed. The wind rustled through the trees, making the branches creak eerily overhead. A crow perched on the roof let out a sharp cry, startling them both. Emma gripped the strap of her backpack tightly, wishing she hadn't agreed to this stupid dare. When they reached the front steps, Jake paused, glancing back at Emma. "You ready?" She swallowed hard but nodded. Together, they climbed the rickety stairs, each step groaning under their weight. At the top, Jake pushed open the door, which swung inward with an ear-splitting creak. A wave of cold air rushed out, sending goosebumps racing up Emma's arms. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the weak sunlight filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows. "See? Nothing scary," Jake whispered, though his voice betrayed his nerves. Emma forced a laugh. "Yeah, totally normal." As they stepped over the threshold, the temperature dropped noticeably. The floorboards beneath their feet felt brittle, as though they might give way at any moment. Dust particles floated lazily in the air, catching the slivers of light. To their left, a staircase spiraled upward into darkness. Straight ahead, a hallway stretched into shadow, lined with doors that hung slightly ajar. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was heavy, pressing down on them like a weight. Then Jake nudged Emma playfully. "Come on, scaredy cat. Let's explore." Emma nodded again, though her heart pounded wildly in her chest. As much as she wanted to leave, she couldn't deny the strange pull the house had on her. It was as if the house itself was daring them to stay, to uncover its secrets. Little did they know, those secrets weren't meant to be discovered. The shadow at the window lingered in Emma's mind, its faceless form burned into her memory like a photograph she couldn't erase. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and her hands trembled as she clutched Jake's arm tighter. "It was there," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible. Right there. Jake stared at the empty window, his flashlight beam scanning the yard outside. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. But no matter how hard he looked, there was nothing. No figure, no movement, nothing out of place. Still, the fear radiating off Emma was contagious. He swallowed hard, trying to push aside the growing unease in his chest. "Okay," he said finally, his tone softer now. "Let's just focus on getting out of here." But the door remained stubbornly shut, refusing to budge despite Jake's repeated attempts. Frustration bubbled inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm, for both their sakes. "There has to be another way out," he muttered, glancing around the room. His eyes landed on a second door tucked away in the far corner, partially hidden by a dusty curtain. Emma followed his gaze and shook her head violently. "No, I'm not going anywhere else in this house. We need to get out now." "I don't know," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to move. Now." "Keep moving," Jake urged, tugging her forward. He didn't dare look back, afraid of what, or who, they might see behind them. Halfway down the stairs, Emma stopped suddenly, her body rigid with terror. "Jake," she choked out, pointing toward the bottom step. At first, Jake didn't understand what she was seeing. Then he noticed it. The rocking chair from the doll room was now sitting at the foot of the staircase, swaying gently as if someone invisible was still perched on it. But that wasn't the worst part. Scattered around the chair were several of the dolls, their cracked faces tilted upward, staring directly at them. They moved. Emma whimpered, tears streaming down her face. They'd followed us. Jake's stomach churned, but he refused to let panic take over. "Don't look at them," he said firmly, pulling her past the unsettling sight. "Just keep going." As they reached the ground floor, the temperature dropped sharply again. Their breaths fogged the air, and the faint smell of earth and decay filled their nostrils. The front door loomed ahead, tantalizingly close, but something blocked their path, a shadowy figure standing silently in the doorway. Its shape was indistinct, wavering like smoke, but the outline of a woman could be seen within the haze. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if studying them. Emma screamed, yanking Jake backward. "It's her. The thing from the window." Jake's mind raced, searching for a solution. There was no way around the figure. It stood squarely in their only exit. Desperation clawed at him. Then he spotted another door on the opposite side of the room. It led to the kitchen, which had windows large enough to climb through. "This way," he shouted, driving Emma toward the kitchen door. Behind them, the shadowy figure let out a low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a sob that sent shivers racing up their spines. They burst into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment, they leaned against it, panting heavily, their hearts hammering in their chests. But even here, surrounded by rusted appliances and broken cabinets, the feeling of being watched persisted. Above the sink, a single window offered a glimpse of freedom and hope. "We can do this," Jake said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Climb out. I'll help you." Emma nodded, scrambling onto the counter. Just as she pushed the window open, the kitchen door rattled violently, as if something or someone was trying to break through. Jake grabbed a nearby chair and wedged it under the handle, buying them precious seconds. "Go," he urged, helping Emma squeeze through the opening. She tumbled onto the grass outside, landing hard but uninjured. Without hesitation, she scrambled to her feet and ran toward the safety of the woods. Jake followed quickly, hoisting himself through the window just as the door burst open behind him. Neither of them looked back. They ran until their legs burned, until the house disappeared behind the trees. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, Emma collapsed onto the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Jake knelt beside her, his own hands shaking. "We're okay," he said, though his voice wavered. "We got out." But deep down, neither of them believed it. Whatever had been in that house wasn't done with them yet. The forest was eerily quiet as Emma and Jake stumbled deeper into the trees, their frantic breaths cutting through the stillness. The cold air bit at their cheeks, and the fading sunlight cast long, jagged shadows across the ground. Neither of them spoke. All they could hear was the sound of their own panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of what they just experienced was pressing down on them. Emma clung to Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his skin like she feared he might disappear if she let go. Her wide eyes darted around, scanning the darkening woods for any sign of movement. "We need to keep moving," she whispered hoarsely, her voice trembling. "It might follow us." Jake nodded, though his mind was racing with questions. What had they seen back there? Was it real, or had fear played tricks on their minds? He didn't have answers, but one thing was certain. They weren't safe yet. Not until they were far away from that house. As they pushed forward, the dense canopy of trees blocked out what little light remained in the sky. Night was falling fast, and with it came an unsettling silence. Even the crickets and owls seemed to have gone quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Do you think we lost it?" Jake asked finally, glancing over his shoulder. The house was no longer visible behind them, hidden by the thick wall of trees. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, "but I don't want to find out." They walked for another 10 minutes before realizing they were completely disoriented. The trees all looked the same, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every direction seemed unfamiliar, and the trail they thought they were following had vanished without a trace. "We're lost," Jake muttered, frustration creeping into his tone. "This isn't good." Emma stopped suddenly, her body stiffening. "Wait! Do you hear that?" Jake froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the forest. Then, faintly, he heard it. A soft, rhythmic creaking sound, almost like footsteps. But these weren't human footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the occasional scrape of wood against dirt. "It's coming closer," Emma whimpered, backing away instinctively. Her gaze darted around wildly, searching for a place to hide, but the trees offered no real shelter. Jake grabbed her hand again, pulling her along. "We can't stay here. Keep moving." They ran blindly, weaving between trees and leaping over roots. The creaking grew louder, closer, echoing unnaturally in the stillness of the forest. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. It sounded like multiple figures moving in unison, surrounding them from all sides. Emma tripped over a root, falling hard onto the damp earth. Jake turned back to help her up, and when he reached for her hand, she screamed. "Behind you," she shrieked, pointing frantically. Jake spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing just a few feet away was one of the dolls from the house, but it wasn't lifeless anymore. Its cracked porcelain face tilted unnaturally, and its glassy eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. In its tiny hands, it clutched a rusted pair of scissors, the blades gleaming wickedly in the moonlight. "What the—" Jake stammered, stumbling backward. Before he could react, more shapes emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, each carrying something sharp or heavy. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around them like a storm. Emma scrambled to her feet, tears streaming down her face. "Run!" she screamed, yanking Jake's arm. "Just run." They bolted in opposite directions without meaning to. Jake sprinted straight ahead, ducking under low-hanging branches and vaulting over fallen logs. Behind him, the dolls pursued relentlessly, their creaking footsteps growing closer with every second. He risked a glance over his shoulder and nearly tripped when he saw how close they were. One of them lunged at him, its tiny hand brushing against his jacket. He swatted it away, his pulse pounding in his ears. Meanwhile, Emma ran toward a cluster of boulders, hoping to use them as cover. She dove behind the largest one, pressing her back against the cold stone and covering her mouth to muffle her breathing. Her chest heaved as she listened for signs of pursuit, but the forest was silent again. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd lost them. Then she heard it. A soft, childlike giggle right next to her ear. Emma froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned her head and screamed. Jake sat on the damp forest floor, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His mind raced, replaying the last few chaotic moments in vivid detail. The creaking footsteps, the glowing eyes of the dolls, and a horrifying realization that Emma was no longer by his side. Panic clawed at him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Emma," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Where are you?" The only response was the eerie silence of the woods. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving an oppressive stillness that made Jake's skin crawl. He scrambled to his feet, scanning the shadows for any sign of her. "Emma!" He called again, louder this time, his voice echoing into the void. There was no answer. Fear gripped him tighter than ever before. He retraced their path, stumbling over roots and rocks as he searched frantically for any clue about where she might be. The forest looked different now, darker, more menacing, and every shadow seemed to twist into something sinister. He couldn't shake the image of those porcelain dolls chasing them, their cracked faces and glowing eyes burned into his memory. After what felt like hours, it was likely only minutes, Jake stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a single doll, sitting upright on a fallen log. Its tiny hands rested neatly on its lap, and its head tilted slightly to one side, as if it were waiting for him. Jake froze, his heart pounding wildly. This wasn't just any doll, it was the same one he'd seen earlier in the house, the one with the faded blue dress and cracked face. "What do you want?" Jake demanded, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound brave. He took a cautious step forward. Then he noticed something clutched in its tiny hands, a piece of fabric. Jake hesitated, then bent down to examine it more closely. It was a scrap torn from Emma's jacket, the bright pink material unmistakable even in the dim light. His stomach churned as dread settled deep within him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no." He grabbed the fabric, clutching it tightly in his fist, as if holding onto it could somehow bring Emma back. But the truth was undeniable. Something had taken her. Something unnatural, something beyond his understanding. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost soothing. They surrounded him, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. Jake spun around, searching for the source. The clearing was empty except for the doll and the ominous silence of the forest. The voices grew louder, overlapping until they formed words. Words he couldn't quite understand but knew weren't meant for him. "Give her back," Jake yelled, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down his face as anger and fear overwhelmed him. He picked up a nearby stick and hurled it at the doll, expecting it to shatter into pieces. Instead, the doll simply fell backward, landing limply on the ground. Its glassy eyes stared up at him, unblinking and emotionless. Jake sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion and despair. He wanted to scream, to cry, to run away, and never look back. But he couldn't leave, not without Emma. She was his best friend, the person who had always been there for him. He owed it to her to keep fighting, no matter how scared he was. As he knelt there, defeated, a faint glimmer caught his eye. Embedded in the dirt near the log was a small metal object, a key. It was old and rusted, its surface etched with strange symbols that Jake didn't recognize. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt drawn to it as though it held some kind of importance. He reached out hesitantly, brushing away the dirt before picking it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, the whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into an unnatural silence. Jake held his breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When nothing did, he shoved the key into his pocket and stood up, determination replacing his earlier despair. "I'll find you, Em," he muttered under his breath, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I promise." With that, he turned and began retracing his steps toward the house. Whatever had taken Emma, whatever secrets lay hidden within those crumbling walls, Jake was determined to uncover them. He didn't know what awaited him inside, or whether he'd make it out alive. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't leaving without her. The forest seemed darker now, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels watching his every move. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was pulling him closer. As he emerged from the woods, the abandoned house loomed before him, its broken windows and sagging porch bathed in moonlight. It looked exactly as it had when they first arrived, except now it felt alive, pulsing with an energy that made Jake's skin crawl. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, gripping the rusted key tightly in his hand. Jake stood frozen in the doorway of the small, windowless room, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the empty space. The message on the wall: "She stays. seemed to burn itself into his mind, each jagged letter mocking him with its finality. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He wanted to scream, to shout Emma's name until his voice gave out, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't do any good. She was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than anything he'd ever felt before. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of loss, of failure. Jake sank to his knees, clutching the rusted key tightly in his fist. Tears streamed down his face as guilt and fear overwhelmed him. He had promised to find her, to bring her back. But now, standing in this cursed room, he realized how powerless he truly was. For a long time, he stayed there, unable to move or think clearly. The house loomed around him, its walls closing in like a predator savoring its prey. Every creak, every groan of the old structure felt deliberate, as if the house itself was alive and watching him. Finally, with great effort, Jake forced himself to stand. He couldn't stay here. Not alone. If he did, he feared he might end up like Emma, or worse. As he stumbled back through the darkened hallways, retracing his steps toward the front door, fragments of what had happened replayed in his mind. The dolls, the whispers, the faceless woman, they'd all seemed surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But the scrap of fabric from Emma's jacket clenched in his other hand was proof enough. When Jake finally emerged into the cool night air, he collapsed onto the porch steps, his body shaking uncontrollably. The forest beyond the yard stretched endlessly, silent and foreboding under the pale glow of the moon. For a moment, he considered running, just disappearing into the trees and never looking back. But where would he go? What could he say? No one would believe him if he told them what had happened. They'd think he was crazy, or worse, responsible for Emma's disappearance. Instead, he sat there for hours, staring blankly at the horizon as dawn slowly crept over the edge of the world. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting long shadows across the decaying house, Jake made a decision. He couldn't leave Emma behind, not completely. Whatever had taken her, whatever secrets the house held, he vowed to uncover them, not for revenge, but for answers, for closure. Over the next few weeks, Jake became obsessed. He spent countless hours researching the history of the house, poring over old newspapers, town records, and local legends. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. Decades ago, a family had lived there, a mother, father, and 2 young children. One day, they vanished without a trace. Their belongings were left untouched, their beds unmade, as if they'd simply stepped outside and never returned. Rumors swirled that the mother had gone mad, driven by grief after losing her husband. Some claimed she lured people into the house, keeping them trapped forever as part of some twisted ritual. But none of it explained why Emma had been taken, or why Jake himself had been spared. One evening, while flipping through an old journal he found in the attic of the library, Jake stumbled upon a passage that sent shivers down his spine. The house feeds on fear. It thrives on those who dare to enter, consuming their souls bit by bit until nothing remains. Once claimed, they cannot leave, not fully. Their spirits linger, bound to the house for eternity. Underneath the passage was a crude drawing of a key nearly identical to the one Jake still carried in his pocket. Below it, scrawled in faded ink, were 3 words. Only one escapes. Jake stared at the page, his blood running cold. Had the house let him go because it had already taken Emma, or was he meant to return, to complete some unfinished purpose? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't forget about Emma. Even if it cost him everything, he would keep searching for a way to bring her back. Because deep down, he believed she was still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of the living, trapped in the endless nightmare of the house. And so, every night when the sun set and the world grew quiet, Jake returned to the edge of the woods, staring at the abandoned house with a mixture of dread and determination. Someday, somehow, he would find a way inside again. This time, he wouldn't leave without her. But as the days turned into weeks, Jake began noticing strange things. Whispers in the wind when no one was around. Shadows moving where there should be none. And sometimes, late at night, he thought he saw a figure standing in the upstairs window of the house, a girl with wide, frightened eyes, mouthing his name. It was Emma. Or maybe it wasn't. Emma woke up to the sound of faint laughter, soft, Childlike giggles that echoed around her like a cruel game. Her head throbbed painfully, and her vision blurred as she tried to focus on her surroundings. The air was cold, damp, and carried the unmistakable smell of earth and decay. Slowly, she realized she wasn't in the forest anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere darker, smaller, and infinitely more terrifying. Her hands were tied behind her back with rough rope, and her legs were bound tightly at the ankles. Panic surged through her veins as she struggled against the restraints. They only dug deeper into her skin. "Jake?" She called out weakly, her voice trembling. "Jake, are you there?" There was no response, only the laughter, which seemed to grow louder with each passing second. It came from all directions, bouncing off unseen walls and wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Emma's breathing quickened as she fought to keep calm, but the oppressive darkness pressed down on her, making it hard to think clearly. As her eyes adjusted, she began to make out shapes in the gloom. She was in a small, windowless room, its walls lined with shelves stacked high with objects she couldn't quite identify. At first glance, they looked like ordinary trinkets, broken toys, tarnished jewelry, cracked picture frames, but something about them felt wrong. Each item seemed to pulse faintly, as if imbued with some kind of unnatural energy. Then she saw them, the dolls. Dozens of them, perched on every available surface, their glassy eyes reflecting what little light filtered through cracks in the ceiling. They weren't just sitting there, they were watching her, their heads tilted slightly, as if studying her every move. Emma's stomach churned, and she squeezed her eyes shut, wishing desperately that this was all a nightmare she could wake up from. But when she opened her eyes again, the scene hadn't changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. One of the dolls, a familiar one with a faded blue dress and cracked porcelain face, was now sitting directly in front of her, close enough for her to see the tiny cracks spiderwebbing across its cheeks. Its lips curled into an unnatural smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth that shouldn't have been there. Emma screamed, recoiling backward until her back hit the wall. The doll didn't move. The laughter grew louder, almost deafening. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Please, leave me alone." A sudden creak made her freeze. From the shadows emerged the faceless woman, the same one she'd seen outside the window earlier. Her form flickered like smoke, shifting between solid and translucent. Her hollow eyes locked onto Emma, and her mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman said, her voice low and raspy, like sandpaper scraping against wood. "This house doesn't let go of its guests." Emma shook her head violently, tears blurring her vision. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to leave." The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Leave? Oh, my dear, you can't leave. Not after seeing what you've seen." "What do you mean?" Emma choked out, her voice barely audible. "What did I see?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, her icy fingers brushing against Emma's cheek. Emma flinched, trying to pull away, but the ropes held her firmly in place. "You saw me?" the woman whispered, her tone soft yet menacing. "And now, you belong to us." The laughter erupted again, louder and more chaotic than before. Shadows swirled around the room, twisting and writhing like living things. The dolls' heads turned in unison, their glowing eyes fixed on Emma. She closed her own eyes, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to bear the sight any longer. When she finally mustered the courage to open them again, the woman was gone. In her place stood Jake, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Emma," he cried, rushing toward her. "Are you okay? I found you." For a brief moment, relief washed over her. He had come back for her. He hadn't abandoned her. But then she noticed something strange. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he were being controlled by invisible strings. And when he smiled, his teeth were jagged, just like the doll's. "Jake," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Is that really you?" His grin widened and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Of course it's me," he said, though his voice sounded distorted, layered with others. "Who else would it be?" Emma's heart sank as realization dawned on her. This wasn't Jake, or at least, not the Jake she knew. Whatever had taken him had twisted him into something else, something monstrous. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed everyone who dared to enter. No, She whimpered, shaking her head. No, please. Don't hurt me.